So climate change is definitely significantly increasing the risk of flooding. But what people forget is it's not just climate change. There's more people, more property, more infrastructure in the floodplain than ever before. And actually over the last 100 years that's increased flood risk more than climate change, although we're starting to see a reverse now.
Welcome back to the National Oceanography Centre's Into the Blue podcast, where we talk to the people leading the way in raising the profile of the ocean through research, exploration and advocacy. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hello, I'm Dr Zoe Jacobs and today I'm joined by Professor Ivan Haigh and Dr Jenny Brown to discuss the growing threat of coastal flooding and how organisations like NOC are coming together to tackle this destructive natural hazard. So welcome to you both, thank you so much for joining us today. So before we get stuck into this topic, I wanted to find out a bit about your respective roles. So Ivan, I'll start with you first. So you work for the University of Southampton. So what is your role there and does it involve NOC at all?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's really lovely to be with you. I'm a professor at the University of Southampton in the School of Ocean and Earth Science. I actually sit in the same building as NOC. So it's a partnership between the university and obviously the National Oceanography Centre. So I've got about sort of 20 years of experience of working on sort of sea level rise and primarily coastal flooding, although in the more recent years I've been sort of working on other sorts of flooding as well. And I've collaborated with Jenny and others at the National Oceanography Centre for many years.
Great, and Jenny, you're at NOC. What is your role at NOC?
Yeah, so I'm one of the scientists here. I'm in the Marine Physics and Ocean Climate Group, but I mainly look at coastal processes. So I'm a scientist that's quite on the beach rather than out in our ships.
Cool. So coastal flooding can cause a lot of damage and it presents major risks to lives and livelihoods. How long have we perceived this as one of the most destructive natural hazards?
Yeah, sure. So flooding has always existed. As long as the world has existed, as long as we've had an ocean, there will always at some point be an extreme event that will cause flooding. So flooding is nothing new. And flooding is the biggest and probably the most destructive sort of natural hazard. So something like a quarter of the world's population, so about 2 billion people, will be exposed to flooding at some point in their lifestyle, at some point in their life. Each year, flooding affects about 50 million people on average, causing damages of upwards of £300 billion on average each year. But coastal flooding is a hazard that probably affects the most people of all of the sort of different types of flooding. In the UK, we have a very, very long history. So, we can trace back. I've built a database called Surge Watch, which Jenny's been involved with, where we've looked at sort of flooding over the last 2,000 years. If you go back to, for example, 1607, more than 2,000 people were actually killed along the Bristol Channel coastline. In living memory, 1953 was a very significant event. It killed about 300 people in the UK, about 1,700 people in the Netherlands. More recently, Jenny, maybe you want to talk a bit about the 2013-14 season?
Yeah, so that was a winter when we had a lot of storms coming in close succession. So we call them a cluster of storm events. And it wasn't just coastal flooding, it was also river flooding. The storms brought a high rainfall as well. And that was kind of a notable point. I guess in my career, we had a research project, we were both working on it, and we were looking at the sequences of storms. And so that was, although it wasn't great for the country, it was well timed for us and our research.
And in the UK, we have what's called the National Risk Register, which is sort of how the government sort of prepares for major risks. So the number one risk on that is actually a pandemic. It's been on there for 20 years, although only recently. But number two is a coastal flood. So coastal flooding does have the potential to really cause significant damage to the UK.
Yeah. And obviously, local communities probably feel the brunt of these impacts. But is it just local communities that are impacted, or does it kind of go further afield than that?
Not at all. So if you think about our rail infrastructure, we have a lot of train lines that run along coastal pathways. We have a lot of road networks that go along the coastline. Also, when we think about the energy sector, nuclear power stations are often sited on coastlines. And that's because you need large amounts of cooling water to help kind of facilitate the generation of the energy. Ports and harbours, farmland. So there's a lot of infrastructure at our coasts. It's not just local communities. So when there are flood events, even if we're not actually impacted ourselves, maybe our energy supply might be impacted, or services are disrupted that we would normally use. So maybe there's a commute that we often do that's on a coastal road, and at high tides it gets cut off, or maybe the main road to the hospital is on a low-lying stretch of land, and that can be cut off, and you have to then divert quite a long way round flooding when it occurs.
Yeah, so it's estimated that about 1 in 6 properties are at risk of flooding in the UK. That's not just coastal flooding, that's the other flooding. But as Jenny says, the impacts can be much more widespread. And in 2013, for example, some of the events in that season, disrupted significant portions of the UK. Yeah.
And how has climate change impacted the dangers of flooding, and how do we anticipate that to be impacted in future? I mean, I presume it's accelerating the risk.
Yes.
Yes.
So there's 4 key factors that I think sort of affect flood risk, and the first is climate change. So from a coastal flooding perspective, there's sort of 2 elements to it. So as our climate has warmed, we've had melting of land-based ice, we've had thermal expansion of the ocean, and sea levels have risen. And so we've seen sea levels rise by about 30 centimetres, and that means that we need smaller events to give us the same level in the past as what would have caused flooding. So even with that small rise in sea level, we have seen that the number of times high waters exceed given thresholds sort of increasing by about a factor of 10. Over the next 100 years, we expect sea levels to rise by at least another metre. So again, that will drive a significant increase in flooding. Coastal flooding, but it's not just sea level rise. We see that with climate change we get more storms, more intense, we get shifts in the tracks of storm surges, so that affects storm surges and waves, which again can kind of enhance flooding. So climate change is definitely significantly increasing the risk of flooding. But what people forget is it's not just climate change. There's more people, more property, more infrastructure in the floodplain than ever before. And actually over the last 100 years, that's increased flood risk more than climate change, although we're starting to see a reverse now. Not only that, but natural habitats that act as a buffer to flooding. So in the Solent area here, salt marshes, around the world, corals, mangroves, all act as a buffer to flooding, but those are in decline. And then finally, our flood defences are getting a lot older now. Many of our flood defences were built 50, 100 years ago. So all of those things, climate change is clearly the thing we're worried about, but all of those together are really going to mean there's going to be a significant risk of not just coastal flooding, but other sources of flooding as well. With a warmer climate, we also get more rainfall. So there'll be more river flooding, more surface flooding. So flooding is a problem that, we really are struggling to handle it now, but as we go into the future, it's something that is, just going to get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
It's probably worth adding that it's also quite a local experience, climate change. So we think about storm tracks, we often think about stormier conditions. But actually, if a track moves away from a location where you're living, you could actually experience less storms, whereas perhaps a neighbouring part of the coastline experiences more. Or maybe a slight change in wind direction will mean that waves will come from a different direction. Maybe there's a headland in the way, so actually you're sheltered, whereas previously you were exposed to open fetches and much longer distances that the waves could travel along. And there's a lot of interacting processes as well. So we think of sea level rise, but that also then influences the waves that approach our coastline. So deeper water levels, larger waves can actually get closer. But the smaller waves, which are perhaps a bit more frequent and typical, in deeper water, they might not break and they might start reflecting off a beach or a structure. So if they reflect away, then they're not so hazardous to us on land.
Yeah. It's a really good point, because we do tend to sort of just talk about sea level rise and the general effect, but actually you're right, it can be very, very localised. And so, doing research into those very local scales is vital.
Very complicated. So many different factors, as usual. So Ivan, you touched just then on coastal defences. So what measures do we actually have in place at the moment to protect coastal communities from flooding?
Oh, well, I guess so Ivan is very interested, he works a lot with Thames Barrier and those types of management plans. But when we go to the coast, we often see coastal schemes. We think of sea walls, we think of the reactive concrete structures, or maybe now we're thinking about nature-based solutions. But actually we also have lots of early warning systems in place. So local authorities, the Environment Agency, coastal groups, they develop predictive schemes based on observations to be able to give advanced warning so we can plan, prepare and respond to these events in advance.
Yeah. And early warnings have come a long way. So in 1953, for example, there was no forecasting services and there was no warnings. The event also struck at night. And if you look at the North Sea, the storm actually sort of progresses down the coastline. So had we had phones and things at the time, had it not been night, we could have communicated, look, something's coming. But 307 people died in that event. But in December 2013, we had an almost identical event and no one died. And that's because, as Jenny says, we've massively improved our forecasting, the Met Office of the Environment Agency, our warning services, we've built flood defences. Increasingly, we're looking to sort of try and move away from traditional flood defences to sort of nature-based solutions. But I think one of the issues that we face is one is, I think, feel entitled to flood defence, but we don't have enough money to build flood defences everywhere. So I think we're going to have some very difficult decisions in the future about, where do we defend, where don't we defend? And nature-based solutions are quite expensive as well. They're not free, so it's quite a complicated space.
That's a good point, actually, because I think nature-based solutions a lot of the time people perceive as free because it's nature, but actually quite expensive to kind of get organised.
Eco-engineering is quite a nice term because it makes you realise you're actually engineering natural processes and there's a cost and resources are required. I guess nature-based solutions, you think it's naturally there and it will be growing on its own.
But I think something that's really underrelated as well is community, a sort of move towards community resilience, that maybe it's not about building new flood defences, but could we change our infrastructure slightly so we have a park that is a park for most of the year, but when a flood happens, the park floods rather than the local houses. Could we build houses on stilts? Could we make our houses more adaptable to sort of cope with flooding in a better way? So I think there's quite some exciting work kind of going on in that area.
Yeah, great.
I think communities don't actually want just bigger seawalls. So we used to think, you can't build infinitely high seawalls, which is true because the foundations can only take a certain weight. But actually, if you live by the coast, you want to be able to see the coast. So people don't actually want these really big sea walls. So very often you'll now see that coastal defences have floodgates in and there's low sections or secondary sea walls. And so people actually have to close the gates if there is a warning that a storm's coming. But some of those gates are just to give you lower sections of wall so you can actually see out, and also to provide you access so you could walk onto the walkways and enjoy the coastline.
And at the other end of the scale, Jenny, you started by talking about the Thames Barrier, but around the world now we have 50 storm surge barriers, mostly located in cities. In a city, they'll often be in an estuary, where you have hundreds of kilometres of sort of coastline exposed to high tides, but there sometimes it does make sense to build a big storm surge barrier. They cost many billions of pounds, but again, London wouldn't exist without the Thames Barrier. The Thames Barrier's closed more than 220 times in the last 40 years to protect London from flooding. So we need a whole range of different approaches and
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wanted to talk to you both a bit about FLOOD-CDT, which is the Centre for Doctoral Training for Resilient Coastal Futures, which you both played a major role in creating. So congratulations on that. Can you tell me a bit about that and why it was set up?
Yeah, so we're super, super excited about this. And Jenny and I have both invested almost 2 years of our life into this centre. So the government has a research institute called UKRI. And within that, they have different funding bodies. So they have the Natural Environmental Research Council, NERC. But last year, NERC released a call for these centres of doctoral training. And you could put in any ideas. So Jenny and I had a phone call. And as we've hinted at already, flooding is getting a lot worse. We're struggling to manage it now. And we thought it would be fantastic to submit a proposal on flooding. We both spent almost 6 months of our life writing this proposal, but we were one of sort of 4 centres that have been funded in the last few years. So it involves 4 universities, Southampton, Newcastle, Bristol and Loughborough. Each of us specialise in different types of flooding. So it's not just coastal flooding, we have river flooding experts, surface flooding, tsunamis, even things like dam breaks. Last year in Libya there was that awful dam break. We have the National Oceanography Centre, we have British Geological Centre and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So it's the 7 organisations. And we also, what's really exciting, have 45 external partners. So we have each of the main government bodies responsible for flooding. We have insurance companies, we have consultancy companies, we have charities. So it's really exciting, but we've managed to, from NERC and commitments from the universities and the partners, we've got about £6.5 million of funding. And so we're able to fund hopefully 56 PhD students over the next 4 years. So a really nice sort of community, and really all of those PhD students are going to be working with end users and really trying to do research projects that actually make a tangible difference to flood risk management in the UK. So that's what the centre's about. So we had our first students starting a month ago in September. So we have 16 students starting this year, hopefully 16 in the next few years. And yeah, we're really excited. We're really hoping that this will be more than just those PhD students, but the research and end user community coming together in the UK to really kind of tackle this growing and very serious problem.
That's amazing to have such good external involvement.
Yeah.
That must have taken so much work, well done.
Yeah, no, and we have fantastic partners, but yeah, it's been a lot of work, but really excited to get it off the ground and just formally started in the last month.
Yeah, awesome. And have there been any major developments since it was set up?
I think the most major development is the recruitment of the first cohort. So the students are in place, and in October we ran the induction week, so we actually got to meet many of them. So they travelled from the different universities to be here in Southampton to meet in person, which was really nice. Our next challenge is setting up the training, so we need to provide training to develop their skills, so that will be starting early next year. And we're just advertising the second set of projects, so we're looking forward to lots of new applicants. Interviewing will be quite busy again in February, March time, but yeah, so we're off to a good start.
Yeah, amazing. Can you give us some examples of some of the projects that have just started then?
Yeah, so we have 16 projects starting this year, very, very multidisciplinary, which is really exciting. So a whole range of things. So one of our students, for example, is looking at, in terms of sea level rise and understanding that often tide gauge records are quite short. So there's a lot of sort of paper-based records, sometimes going back over 100 years. So his PhD, for example, is looking at, could we use machine learning, AI to try and digitize, capture these records so we can understand in a better way how coastal flooding has changed. We have another student who's looking at a sort of a new satellite mission that sort of measures not just the ocean but water bodies in much higher resolution, looking at, can we improve understanding of flooding during that. We have another student that's looking at how households can adapt to flooding. Another one looking at how flooding is affecting, for example, the flower community. In Scotland, we have a very big daffodil flower industry, and flooding is increasingly sort of having negative ramifications of that. So a whole wide range of projects. Those are just some examples.
The daffodil one actually really interested me because I don't work in that field at all. But actually, having to transport flowers quickly wherever they may need to go, that creates quite a large carbon footprint. So you have an industry that's being impacted by flooding, yet it's kind of quite a contributor to climate issues. So that was an interesting.
Yeah, the planes and the trucks that then take them from the airport have to be refrigerated, and you've got 48 hours from when the plant is picked to when it has to be on sale. So if flooding affects, and flooding can affect any part of that supply chain. It can flood the flower fields, but it could stop the airport from operating. It could block a motorway. So that's a very interesting project.
Very multidisciplinary, as you say. Awesome. And what are the future ambitions for the centre? Where do you see it going?
So yeah, we've just started our first cohort. We'll hopefully have 4 cohorts in total. We have enough money for 4 cohorts, sort of 56 students. We're hoping that, that with the involvement of these 45 partners, that we could carry on beyond that, that, there'll be enough evidence that this is making a real tangible difference. But my heart is that these students will, once they finish their PhDs, actually go on and work in the industry, work for these different organisations. And my hope, I don't know about yours, Jenny, is that we will just really bring the flooding community together across the UK with all of these different organisations, work much more closely together, and just really hope that, we can make a tangible difference in the UK, but also then export that knowledge to elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, so our aim is not to kind of grow people who are going to stay in academia. We really want to get them out there in industry, which is why we've got all of these industry partners, so they can actually have placements, experience, and understand how research can really impact the real world and be applied. And then hopefully when they go out into the real world, they'll have kind of a good group of friends who are multidisciplinary, and they can start bringing all the different aspects of the issue together.
And one of our real visions is to bridge that gap. So you often have scientists that aren't very good communicators, and you have good communicators that don't understand. And we really want to try and generate a sort of new group of people who can sit in that gap and who are very, very knowledgeable, but can communicate with policymakers, with MPs, in a very effective, engaging way.
Yeah, that sounds great. You're really kind of like building the foundations of a really strong network there, like end to end. Yes. Yeah, that's great. Well, good luck. I really look forward to hearing more about it over the next few years, especially the outcomes of all of those PhDs. Very interesting. Okay, final question to you both. So, Ivan, I'll come to you first. So what do you see as the most important thing we need to do to try and reduce the impact of coastal flooding?
So I think, first of all, we just desperately and very rapidly need to reduce our carbon emissions. We have this 1.5 and 2 degree world that you'll hear about a lot on the news, and those aren't just pulled out of thin air. That if temperature goes above 1.5 to 2 degrees, there's some very important tipping points. At the moment, a new report that just came out that shows we're definitely on track for between a 3 and 4 degree world. Now, one of the problems with coastal flooding is that even if we reduce our emissions now and go into negative emissions, sea levels are going to continue to rise for hundreds of years. We've warmed the surface of the ocean. So in a sense, coastal flooding is going to continue to grow even if we go into negative emissions, but we just really need to get our act together. We need to be writing to our MPs, we need to be putting pressure on, we need to individually, but I think we need to acknowledge that coastal flooding is going to be a problem for many, many decades to come. And we also need to acknowledge that in this financial climate, we aren't going to protect the coast everywhere. So I think we have to really come up with innovative solutions of maybe moving away from flood zones, but how we can make communities more resilient to flooding. We need to stop building on floodplains. That's a key thing. What else, Jenny?
I was thinking, I think everyone needs to kind of take responsibility themselves. So we all have to kind of look at our lives, our lifestyles, and see, are there any changes we can make ourselves? So, okay, you can't change everything, but if everybody did a small something, that would add up and have a huge impact and help reduce emissions, I'd say.
Yeah.
And I would just love us to have more public awareness of flooding. 1.4 million people live in London in the floodplain, and they probably don't even realise they're living in the floodplain. So, I think it'd be really nice for, and so people to be aware that, that they're in a flooded area and that, so I think that's something as well I'd like to sort of see increased awareness of.
That's a good point, actually, because as you say, we've got the Thames barrier, so people are probably blissfully unaware that if that wasn't there, they would be in trouble. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today.
Cool. Really pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Zoe.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. To ensure you don't miss out on future episodes, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.